Chapter 1. The winter that should have killed him. The wind that winter did not howl. It screamed. It tore across the Appalachian Mountains like something alive, ripping through spruce and pine, hurling snow sideways in blinding sheets. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, and the sun vanished for days at a time. Livestock froze where they stood. Rivers locked solid beneath glassy skin. Entire families abandoned their cabins and fled downhill before the mountains sealed them in. And somewhere high along Black Spruce Ridge, a man stayed behind. Weeks later, when the storm finally broke and a small search party climbed toward the isolated cabin, they did not expect to find anyone alive. No fire smoke rose from the chimney. The roof sagged inward under the weight of snow. The well beside the house was completely buried, but the door was still standing. They forced it open with numb hands and stepped into a silence so complete it felt sacred. Inside, the smell hit them first. Burned wood, wet wool, something coppery beneath it all. The hearth was packed with the charred remains of furniture, chairs, maybe part of the table. Frost coated the interior walls in delicate white crystals. Deep scratches marked the timber beside the window, long vertical gouges carved into the grain. And in the far corner sat Elias Boone. Barefoot, wrapped in torn blankets, his beard crusted in ice. Alive. His eyes followed them, but he did not speak. Not when they called his name. Not when they touched his shoulder. Not when they carried him outside into the pale winter light. There was only one set of footprints leading away from the cabin during the entire storm, his. But he had not come to the mountain alone. When the men searched the property, they found no second body, no tracks buried nearby, no sign of struggle outside, just the cabin and the marks on the walls. By the time spring melted the ridge clear, word had already spread through the valley. Some claimed he had eaten whatever, or whoever, had been trapped with him. Others believed something else had climbed out of the woods and into that cabin during the long nights of January. Elias survived the coldest winter the region had seen in decades. But survival is not the same thing as salvation. Because when he finally began to speak months later, his story did not make sense. He said the mountain knocked. He said it counted. And he said the worst part was not the cold, it was the waiting between the knocks. Next, we discover who Elias Boone was before the mountain buried him in snow. Before we continue with the unspeakable secrets, only the bravest should hit subscribe. Are you ready to face the darkest chapters of history? Join us now and prove your courage. Chapter 2. The Man Who Chose the Mountain. Long before the snow-buried Black Spruce Ridge, Elias Boone had already begun disappearing. Not physically, but inwardly. By the autumn of 1898, he was a man carrying too much silence. He had worked the rail lines through eastern Kentucky for nearly a decade, laying track, hauling timber, driving spikes into frozen earth until his palms blistered raw. It was brutal work, but it paid, and for a while it gave him something solid beneath his feet. Until the accident. One misread signal, one delayed warning. A freight car uncoupled on a slope slick with rain. 2 men crushed before anyone could shout. Elias survived. Survival, he would later learn, can be its own punishment. The company called it misfortune. The newspapers barely mentioned it. But among the workers, there were whispers that he hesitated, that he saw something wrong and didn't act fast enough. He never defended himself. Instead, he left. By October, he had traded noise for distance. He purchased a mule, a few traps, salt pork, flour and tools. He headed toward the higher elevations of the Appalachian Range, beyond the valleys where most families gathered for winter. Locals at the trading post in town warned him. "Black Spruce Ridge," one old man muttered. "Snow drifts taller than houses up there. Wind don't stop for prayer." Elias only nodded. "I won't be there long." He was lying. He chose the mountain because it promised isolation. No witnesses, no murmured blame, no waking in the night to the echo of metal snapping loose. The cabin he found had been abandoned for years. Crooked foundation, one window cracked, roof sagging slightly at one edge. but it stood, and that was enough. He worked methodically, replaced warped planks, reinforced the door with a heavy crossbar, stacked firewood into neat rows beneath a tarp, cleared snow channels away from the well. His hands stayed busy. His thoughts quieter. Then, in early December, as frost crept permanently across the ground, a second figure appeared on the ridge trail. Thomas Bellamy. Younger, clean-shaven, educated by the look of him, he carried a leather case wrapped in oilcloth filled with books and loose papers. "I was told this cabin might stand through winter," Thomas said, teeth chattering lightly. "I need quiet, just until spring." Elias studied him. The mountain already felt less forgiving with another heartbeat nearby. "You won't find easier weather below," Elias replied. "Storm's coming early." Thomas offered a hopeful smile. "I don't scare easy." That was the last confident thing either man would say for months. They agreed to share the space, split the woodcutting, ration supplies carefully, hunt when weather allowed. For a short while, it almost felt manageable, until the first snow came, and did not stop. By mid-January, the windows were half buried. The door needed shoveling each morning just to open. Traps froze useless in the ice, and food began disappearing faster than either man expected. But hunger would not be the thing that truly tested them. The first sound came on the 17th night. 3 soft knocks. Next, the storm seals them in. And the knocking begins. Disclaimer. This story is completely fictional. While it draws inspiration from the real history, geography, and culture of the Appalachian Mountains in the late 19th century, all characters and events are entirely imagined for storytelling purposes. Chapter 3. Sealed in White. By the second week of January, the world beyond the cabin had ceased to exist. Snow rose in hardened walls against the logs, sealing the lower half of the windows. The chimney coughed smoke only when the wind allowed it. Some mornings the door would not budge until Elias forced his shoulder against it, the packed drifts resisting like stone. Inside, the air had grown stale. Wet wool hung from pegs near the hearth, never fully drying, the smell of damp wood mixed with wood smoke and unwashed bodies. Their breaths hovered in the air even when the fire burned steady. Every surface felt dusted in fine frost. Food became arithmetic. They counted beans by handful, measured flour carefully, melted snow in iron pots for water. The salted pork shrank daily. Thomas began suggesting smaller portions, though neither of them said the word ration out loud. Hunger sharpens the senses. It also dulls patience. Thomas filled long evenings reading passages from his manuscript by lantern light. His voice echoed strangely in the small space, as though the cabin had become hollow. Elias listened at first, but words blurred together after a time. He preferred listening to the structure itself, the creaking beams, the shifting weight of snow overhead. On the 17th night, the wind stopped. That was what unsettled him most. The sudden stillness pressed against the walls like cupped hands. Elias awoke before the sound came. His eyes opened into darkness thick as ink. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint orange veins in the coals. Then, knock. Soft, measured. 3 taps against wood. Across the room, Thomas inhaled sharply. "You heard that," he whispered. Elias didn't answer. Knock. Same rhythm. Not frantic, not desperate, controlled. The cabin had only one door, and beyond it lay several feet of drifted snow and dense forest no trail. Vela would attempt crossing in a storm. Thomas sat upright, pulling his blanket tightly around his shoulders. "It's the wind shifting debris," he insisted, though his voice trembled. The air inside felt charged now, thin and metallic. Knock. Closer this time. Elias rose slowly, joints stiff from cold. He took the rifle from beside the hearth. The wood stock felt solid in his palms, grounding him. He stepped toward the door. Each floorboard creaked louder than usual. Thomas's whisper followed him. "If someone's out there." "No one's out there," Elias said quietly. He lifted the heavy crossbar and pulled the door inward. A blade of frozen air sliced through the cabin. Snow whipped in immediately, scattering across the floor. The night outside was pale under a veiled moon. Trees stood motionless, thick with ice. No footprints, no movement. Nothing but untouched snow stretching into darkness. Elias stepped onto the narrow porch, boots crunching lightly. He scanned the clearing, his breath clouded before him. Silence. He crouched and ran his hand through the snow just outside the threshold. Smooth, unbroken. Behind him, Thomas called out nervously, "Is someone there?" Elias began to shake his head, and then he saw it. Above the door frame. 3 vertical gouges freshly carved into the wood, pale splinters still clinging to the edges. His stomach tightened. He was certain those marks had not been there earlier. Knock. This time from behind him, from inside the cabin. Thomas screamed. The door was still open. The sound had come from within the walls. Slow. 3 deliberate taps. Elias felt something cold settle deeper than the winter. The mountain was not outside the cabin. It was already inside. Next, Elias searches the walls and discovers the cabin may not have been as empty as they believed. Chapter 4. Inside the walls. The scream did not last long. Thomas's voice cracked into silence as Elias slammed the cabin door shut, forcing the crossbar back into place with shaking hands. Snow scattered across the floorboards and began melting into dark stains. The fire flared as wind slipped down the chimney. Inside the walls. Knock. 3 taps again. Not loud, not frantic. Measured. Elias turned slowly toward the sound. Thomas stood near the hearth, face drained of color, eyes wide and glassy in the lantern light. "It's in here," Thomas breathed. The tapping came from the rear wall, opposite the door, a section of timber slightly darker than the rest, swollen from years of damp. Elias stepped closer. The cabin felt smaller now, air thinner, the scent of old rot and smoke stronger near that wall. He pressed his palm flat against the wood, cold, colder than the surrounding logs. Knock, directly under his hand. Thomas staggered back, knocking over a tin cup that clattered loudly onto the floor. The sudden noise made both men flinch. "Animals burrow," Thomas stammered. "Rats, or—" "That isn't gnawing," Elias said. The rhythm was deliberate, even, spaced. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Elias grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth. He wedged its tip between the seams of the darker planks and pried hard. Old nails shrieked as they loosened. Splinters cracked away. The tapping stopped. Silence flooded the cabin. Thomas held his breath so long his chest began to tremble. Elias pulled the first plank free. Behind it was darkness, not insulation, not stone, empty space, a hollow cavity large enough for a man to crawl through. A sour smell leaked out, earth and something older, damp soil, stale air untouched by firelight for years. "This cabin," Thomas whispered, voice breaking. "It wasn't built alone." Elias widened the opening with 2 more blows of the poker. Dust drifted down, mixing with frost in the lantern glow. He crouched and lifted the lantern toward the gap. The hollow space extended downward beneath the cabin floor, disappearing into shadow. Rough wooden beams formed a crude shaft leading into what looked like a small root cellar, or something like it. Except neither of them had known it was there. Another sound drifted upward. Not knocking now. Scraping. Slow. Dragging. From below. Thomas let out a strangled whisper. Someone could be trapped down there. But Elias felt something twist in his gut. If someone were trapped, where were the footprints outside? Where was the disturbance in the snow? The scraping continued, wood against wood. Then, 3 taps, from beneath the floor. The lantern flame flickered violently, nearly going out. Thomas grabbed Elias's arm. "Don't go down there." Elias didn't respond immediately. His pulse beat against his ribs, steady but heavy. The rational part of his mind told him it was likely an old animal den, perhaps a fox forced upward by storm. But animals do not carve marks above door frames. Animals do not knock in rhythm. The scraping stopped. Silence again. Too complete. Elias straightened slowly and said something Thomas would later remember with perfect clarity. "If something's under this cabin, it's been there longer than we have." A faint draft rose from the hole, carrying a scent sharper now, metallic, like old blood frozen into earth. And then, from somewhere deeper below, a voice. Soft, almost breathless. "Let me in." Thomas stumbled backward, crashing into the table. Elias felt every hair along his arms stand upright, because the voice did not echo. It did not sound distant. It sounded close, and it sounded exactly like Thomas. Next, Elias must decide whether to descend into the darkness or seal the HOCs, hollow forever. Chapter 5. The Descent. Thomas staggered backward, knocking into the table so hard the lantern nearly tipped. His face had gone pale beneath the flickering light. "I didn't say that," he whispered. "Elias, I didn't." The hollow beneath the floor breathed cold air into the cabin, damp, metallic, ancient. Elias crouched again near the opening, lantern raised. His mind fought to stay steady. Hunger does things to a man. So does isolation. He knew that. He reminded himself of it. The voice had sounded like Thomas, but it had come from below. "Let me in." This time fainter, almost pleading. Thomas shook his head violently. "We seal it. We nail it shut right now." Elias didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on the shaft beneath them. Rough-cut beams formed a narrow drop, maybe 6 feet down into packed earth. The cabin had no cellar entrance, no trap door. This had been hidden deliberately. The wind outside shifted again, pressing against the logs. For a moment, the world beyond the cabin felt very far away. "We need to see," Elias said quietly. Thomas grabbed his arm. "See what?" "You heard it. That's not a man." Elias turned slowly. "Then what is it?" Thomas had no answer. Silence returned, too thick, too watchful. Elias slid his boots closer to the opening. He placed the lantern on the floor beside it and lowered himself carefully, gripping the beams. The wood was slick with old moisture. Splinters bit into his palms. "Elias, don't!" Thomas hissed. But Elias dropped. His boots hit earth. The cold down there was different, deeper, heavy. The smell intensified immediately. Wet soil, rot, iron. He held the lantern up. The space was small, no larger than a pantry. Rough walls carved straight into the ground. Old wooden shelves lined one side, long collapsed inward. And on the far wall, marks. 3 vertical gouges, deeper than the ones above the dew, or carved repeatedly into the dirt itself. Elias stepped forward slowly. The flame flickered violently, bending toward the wall as if drawn there. "Is someone there?" he called, voice low. The only response was a faint shifting sound to his left. He turned. In the far corner of the cellar, partially buried in earth, was something pale. Not stone, not wood, bone. A rib cage, half exposed, frozen into soil. Human. Elias's throat tightened. Above him, Thomas called down in a shaking voice, "What do you see?" Elias did not answer immediately, because he saw something else now. Footprints, in the dirt, fresh, bare, leading from the bone-filled corner toward where he stood, but there was no one in the cellar with him. The voice came again, right behind his ear. "Let me in." The lantern shattered against the ground. Darkness swallowed everything. Above, Thomas screamed, and something moved in the cellar with Elias. Next, the storm worsens, and only one man climbs back out of the dark. Yes, Chapter 6. Only one comes back up. Thomas heard the lantern shatter, glass striking stone, metal clanging. Then darkness swallowed the hollow beneath the cabin hole. "Elias!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside the opening. "Answer me!" No reply. Only the low hiss of wind outside and the faint crackle of the struggling fire. Thomas grabbed the second lantern from the shelf with shaking hands. His fingers felt numb, clumsy. He lit it, nearly dropping the match twice before the wick caught. He held the lantern over the opening. Elias? At first there was nothing. Then, breathing, heavy, ragged. Movement scraped against the wooden beams. A hand shot upward from the dark. Thomas jerked back, the lantern nearly slipping from his grip. The hand gripped the edge of the floorboards tightly, fingers pale, nails packed with dirt. Elias pulled himself up slowly. His face appeared in the light. But something was wrong. His expression was blank, too blank. His eyes wide but unfocused, like a man waking from deep sleep. "You're bleeding," Thomas whispered. A thin line of blood trailed down from Elias's hairline, cutting through the frost on his skin. He climbed fully out, breathing hard, then rolled onto his back beside the opening. Thomas leaned over him. "What happened down there? What did you see?" Elias blinked slowly. "There was nothing," he said flatly. Thomas froze. "You were screaming." "I don't remember screaming." "You dropped the lantern." Silence. Elias sat up slowly, his gaze drifting toward the far wall where the gouges had been carved. "They were already there," he murmured. "The marks." Thomas swallowed. "The bones?" Another pause. Elias's jaw tightened. "There's no one under the cabin." The lie hung in the air between them. Thomas could hear it. He stepped toward the opening again and raised the lantern higher, angling it down into the hollow. The cellar was empty. No bones, no footprints, no gouges in the dirt, just smooth earth. Undisturbed. Thomas's breathing quickened. "That's not possible." Elias stood abruptly, gripping his shoulder. "We seal it." "But you said, 'We seal it.'" His voice was sharp now, authoritative, final. Together they forced the planks back into place. Elias hammered nails through them with violent precision, each strike echoing louder than necessary. Wood splintered under the force. When it was done, the floor looked solid again, unbroken, as though the hollow had never existed. The knocking did not return that night. But something else changed. Elias did not sleep. He sat upright in the dark, staring at Thomas long after the fire burned low. Listening, waiting. And sometime near dawn, as frost crept across the window in delicate white veins, Thomas woke to find Elias standing over him, whispering. 3 words. "Don't let it count." Next, hunger deepens, and Thomas begins to fear the man beside him more than the storm outside. Chapter 7. Hunger Changes a Man. By the 3rd week of January, the storm returned with renewed violence. Wind battered the cabin in relentless waves, forcing snow through the smallest cracks in the timber. The chimney groaned under pressure. Ice formed along the interior walls in delicate spiderweb patterns. Inside, the temperature dropped again. But it was the hunger that began to gnaw louder than the wind. The salted pork was gone. Flour reduced to less than a cup. Beans counted one by one before boiling. Thomas tried to maintain routine. He read aloud from his manuscript each evening, though his voice had grown thin and hollow. He spoke of distant cities and imagined futures, as if language could warm the room. Elias no longer listened. He sat near the door most days, staring at it as though expecting something, or someone. "You need to eat," Thomas urged one afternoon, pushing a tin bowl toward him. Elias glanced down at the small portion, then back at Thomas. "You take it." Thomas hesitated. "We divide evenly." Elias's gaze lingered too long. Thomas suddenly felt aware of the shape of his own hands, the thinness creeping into his wrists, the sound his stomach made when it growled. The cabin had become oppressively quiet. No more knocking, no more scraping beneath the floor. But Elias had begun counting. Thomas noticed it first at night. Elias would sit upright in the darkness and whisper, 1. Silence. 2. Longer silence. Then, barely audible, 3. Thomas pretended to sleep the first time he heard it, but by the fourth night, the pattern was undeniable. "What are you counting?" Thomas asked finally. Elias didn't look at him, making sure it doesn't. "Doesn't what?" Elias's jaw tightened. "Finish." Thomas lay awake long after Elias's breathing slowed. His thoughts turned darker with each passing hour. He remembered the cellar that no longer existed, the bones that had vanished, the fresh gouges on the wall. He considered the possibility that isolation had cracked something inside Elias's mind. But a worse thought crept in. What if it hadn't? By morning, Elias insisted they search outside for trapped game despite the dangerous drifts. Thomas followed reluctantly, pulling his coat tighter against the slicing cold. The world beyond the cabin was almost unrecognizable. Snow had reshaped the land into smooth white dunes, trees bowed under ice. They checked the traps they had set weeks ago. All empty, except the last one near the tree line. The wire had snapped, not chewed, cut cleanly. Thomas stared at it. "You see that?" Elias knelt slowly beside the broken trap, touching the severed edge. Fresh, not frozen over. Someone or something had been there recently. But there were no footprints, no disturbances, only wind-brushed snow stretching in every direction. Elias stood very still. "They're still counting," he murmured. Thomas felt something shift in the air behind them. A presence. When he turned, he saw footprints, bare, appearing one by one in the snow about 20 feet away, pressing downward into untouched white, as if invisible feet were walking toward them. 1, 2, 3. Elias grabbed Thomas's arm. "Run!" Next, only one set of footprints will lead back to the cabin. Chapter 8. Footprints in the Snow. The snow was endless, stretching in every direction like a frozen ocean. Wind ripped across Black Spruce Ridge in furious, unrelenting waves, cutting at exposed skin with icy knives. Thomas and Elias moved cautiously, the broken trap still fresh in their minds, the air heavy with the scent of damp pine and frost. Every step was a struggle through waist-deep drifts. Then Thomas saw them. Footprints. At first, he thought they must be his own, pressed backward by the wind. But no, these were deeper, wider, and appeared where no one could have walked. Bare feet, pressed directly into the untouched snow. 1, 2, 3, and they led toward them slowly, methodically. Elias froze. His breath hung in the air like mist. "They're counting," he whispered, voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. Thomas blinked. "Who? Who's counting?" Elias didn't answer. He only backed toward the cabin, eyes darting over the snow and shadowed tree line. The footprints continued advancing, moving in perfect rhythm, step by step toward them. There was no sound accompanying them, no crunch of snow, no creak of ice, only the wind and the relentless progression of those mysterious tracks. Panic began to rise in Thomas's chest. It's impossible. No one could survive out here. Not in this storm." "Maybe it's an animal," Thomas suggested, though the thought sounded hollow even to him. Elias shook his head. "Animals don't count." The footprints stopped abruptly 20 feet away, and in that silence Thomas felt the air shift, grow heavier, as if the storm itself was watching. Then a knock. One single, deliberate rap carried faintly through the storm. Thomas's heart jumped. He looked at Elias, whose face was pale beneath layers of frost and shadow. "Don't," Elias murmured. "Whatever you hear, don't respond." Thomas didn't understand, but the next sound made him. It wasn't knocking this time. It was a whisper, almost indistinguishable against the wind. a voice saying, clearly, painfully, "Let me in." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His fingers trembled around the worn rifle he carried. He scanned the trees and snow, but nothing moved. Nothing should have moved. Then the footprints shifted again. They weren't moving toward them. They were circling, surrounding them, each print leaving no trace of its origin. The white snow, so pristine moments before, now felt like a trap. Elias grabbed Thomas by the arm. "Inside. Now." They ran back to the cabin, snow crunching underfoot, lungs burning. Elias slammed the door behind them, barring it with the heavy crossbar. Silence followed, oppressive and absolute, broken only by the groaning wind outside. They pressed themselves against the far wall, watching the window. The footprints had vanished, but the marks on the doorframe, carved faintly into the wood, glimmered in frost like tiny warnings. Thomas shivered. What are we dealing with?" Elias's lips pressed into a thin line. "Something that doesn't die. Something that counts." The storm raged on, but inside, a new terror had settled. Because whatever had left those footprints, whatever had circled them, was patient, and it knew the cabin existed. Next, the hunger and fear collide, and Thomas realizes survival might demand a choice darker than any winter. Did you know? One of the most devastating winter storms ever recorded in the eastern United States struck the Appalachian Mountains in late November 1950. Known as the Great Appalachian Storm, this colossal weather event dumped as much as 57 inches, over 4.5 feet of snow in parts of the central Appalachians, with even higher amounts reported in mountainous areas such as Coburn Creek, West Virginia. The storm combined severe cold, heavy snowfall, and hurricane-force winds, creating blizzard conditions that paralyzed transportation and isolated communities for days. This storm was so powerful that it became one of the costliest in U.S. history at that time, and it stands as a stark example of how brutal Appalachian winters can be, with deep snow, drifts, and extreme wind creating life-threatening conditions far worse than typical mountain storms. Use this real historical context near the beginning or end of your video to ground your fictional narrative in true Appalachian winter extremes. It helps viewers understand that although your story is fictional, the harshness of Appalachian winters has real historical precedent. Chapter 9. The Hunger Turns. Inside the cabin, the storm had become a constant roar. The wind shook the walls and rattled the chimney like a living thing. Snow piled against the door so heavily that even Elias struggled to shove it open. But neither of them moved toward it. They had learned. Whatever left those footprints, whatever had circled the cabin, was patient, watching, waiting, counting. Food had dwindled almost entirely. Flour, beans, and salted pork had been rationed for days. Thomas's stomach growled, the hollow sound echoing in the small space. Elias sat near the door, expression distant, lips pressed tight, counting silently, always counting. Thomas tried to keep himself busy. He checked the fire, shook out wet blankets, read aloud from his manuscript. Words that had once felt comforting now seemed meaningless. He couldn't escape the hollow weight in the air. Night fell. Darkness pressed against the walls like a living thing. And then he noticed it. Elias whispering again, numbers curling off his tongue, barely audible, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3. Thomas froze. Each word felt like an accusation. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked. His voice shook. Elias didn't meet his eyes. "Counting, making sure it doesn't finish." Thomas wanted to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. The hunger made the air thick. His hands shook. He realized he would have eaten anything to keep the noise of the counting away. The wind howled harder. The cabin seemed to shrink. Shadows pressed closer. Then a scrape, metal against wood from beneath the floor. The hollow shaft. Thomas's pulse quickened. "It's back." Elias's eyes were hard. "I warned you. It counts. We can't leave it unfinished. Thomas didn't understand. Hunger and fear collided in his chest. He wanted to argue, but the voice came again. Softer now, seductive. Let me in. He shivered. The air seemed heavier. The smell of wet earth and something iron-like filled the cabin. Suddenly, Elias reached into his coat and produced a small dagger. Thomas noticed how the blade gleamed even in the dim firelight. Elias held it tightly. His face was pale, almost inhuman. They want to see if we'll do what's necessary, Elias whispered. What? Do what? Thomas stammered. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the door. The crossbar rattled. The wind outside pressed hard. Snowdrifts scratched the windows like fingernails. Thomas followed, but fear rooted him. He realized too late that the hunger in the cabin wasn't just for food. It was for patience, for fear, for a test they hadn't signed up for. And then the first step came. Outside the cabin, the snow shifted. One solitary bare footprint appeared, pressing into untouched drifts. Thomas's eyes widened. It's here. Elias didn't flinch. It's always here, waiting, counting, watching. And soon, he paused, voice barely above a whisper. Someone has to finish it. Next, the storm closes in completely, and the first violent encounter between man and the unseen presence begins. Chapter 10. The first encounter. The wind had become deafening. Snow lashed the cabin walls in jagged, icy lines, shaking the roof as though trying to tear it off entirely. Thomas and Elias huddled near the hearth, though the flames did little to fight the cold that had seeped deep into their bones. And then the noise started. Not outside this time. Inside. Something scraping along the floorboards near the wall, the hollow that had once held the bones, the cavity that should not have existed. The sound was deliberate, slow, measured. 3 scratches, then silence, then 3 more. Thomas's stomach knotted. He wanted to run, to throw open the door and escape into the storm, but there was no escape. The snow had grown taller than the doorframe. Outside, the ridge was a frozen tomb. Elias rose, dagger in hand. His eyes were sharp, unyielding. It's testing us, he whispered. It wants to see who will finish the counting. Thomas barely understood what he meant, but the next moment he did. A shadow flickered against the far wall. Not cast by the fire, something moving in the darkness. Elias? Thomas hissed. The shadow shifted closer, gliding across the frost-lined floor. It had no form, yet the presence was tangible. Cold pressed against Thomas's chest, sharp and metallic. Then it spoke, soft, whimpering, pleading, and yet unmistakably human. Let me in. Elias stepped forward, holding the dagger at his side, voice steady. Not yet. Not until the counting is done. Thomas's hands shook. The firelight caught the edge of the shadow. It seemed to stretch, elongate, defy the walls of the cabin. Another scrape from the hollow. Another set of taps. 3. Thomas realized then that the shadow was moving in rhythm with the counting. Every tap, every scrape, every whisper. It followed Elias's silent numbers. Do you see it now? Elias said. His voice was calm, almost serene. This isn't hunger. This isn't cold. This is the mountain. The mountain doesn't care about your life. It cares about balance. And it counts. Thomas stumbled backward, nearly falling over the remnants of the broken lantern. The shadow advanced closer. A sharp metallic smell filled the air, and Thomas's stomach turned. Elias gripped his arm. We do what it asks, or it takes what it wants. The shadow pressed closer. It did not speak now. Only the rhythm of counting echoed in Thomas's ears. And then the first violent movement. The shadow lunged, or perhaps it was the wind, but Thomas felt the icy force slam into him, knocking him off his feet. The cabin erupted into chaos. The fire hissed as snow blew through the open cracks. The shadow twisted, circled, and waited for them to respond. Elias stood tall, dagger raised. His whisper cut through the storm. Finish the count, or die. Next, desperation takes hold, and Thomas learns the full price of survival in a winter that does not forgive. Chapter 11. The price of survival. The cabin shook as the shadows circled them, silent but oppressive. Thomas struggled to his knees, every muscle frozen, heart hammering. Outside, the wind howled like a beast with jaws clamping down on the ridge. Inside, the air was thick with frost, fear, and something darker, something that tasted metallic on the tongue. Elias's dagger gleamed in the firelight. He didn't flinch. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Thomas realized the numbers matched the rhythm of the taps, the scratches, the whispers. It was not Elias himself, he thought in horror, but a rhythm, a contract, something older than the snow, something that demanded obedience. He tried to speak. Elias, what is it? Elias's eyes met his, cold, deadly, focused. It doesn't forgive hesitation. You survive by doing what it demands. Otherwise... A pause. Thomas felt it in his chest. A crushing presence. Otherwise, it chooses for you. The shadow lunged again. Thomas stumbled backward, barely avoiding icy fingers that seemed to claw at him from the floorboards. Snow from outside pressed through cracks, blanketing the cabin in white, but this was inside, inescapable. Elias stepped forward calmly, dagger poised. We have a choice, he said, almost to himself. Finish the count. Or we let it take what it wants. Thomas's stomach churned. His hunger had grown unbearable. His hands shook uncontrollably. And then it hit him. The hunger was not just physical. It was survival itself, gnawing, demanding action. The shadow hovered near the floor. Its voice, now a chorus of whispers, hissed around the cabin. 1, 2, 3. Let me in. Finish. Elias grabbed Thomas's wrist. You do it, or it dies with you. Only one way. Thomas looked at the dagger in Elias's hand, trembling. He understood finally. Survival demanded sacrifice. And in the harshest winter, hum and morality had no shelter. His fingers brushed the dagger. The shadow pressed closer, anticipation rising like the frozen tide outside. Elias's whisper was sharp, like ice against stone. Do it. Thomas's mind screamed, but his body obeyed. Hunger, fear, and the mountain itself pushed him forward. The shadow recoiled slightly, as if acknowledging his movement. The counting continued. 3, pause. 3, pause. Longer now, more insistent. Then silence. For a moment, Thomas thought they had survived, that perhaps the mountain, the shadow, had accepted the count. But Elias's eyes narrowed. This is only the beginning, he said. Winter decides slowly, and it remembers. Outside, the wind shrieked louder than ever. Inside, the cabin was cold. Frost crept along the floorboards. The shadow was gone, but Thomas knew it was only waiting. Patient. Counting. Next, Thomas and Elias will face the longest night of their lives, where frost, hunger, and the unseen will converge to test every shred of their humanity. Chapter 12. The Longest Night. Night in the mountains had a weight all its own, but that evening it pressed down on the cabin like a living entity. Wind tore through the ridges outside, howling and rattling the roof with a fury that seemed to echo the counting that had begun weeks ago. Inside, Thomas and Elias huddled near the fire, though the flames offered little warmth. The remnants of their food lay untouched on a tin plate. Neither man spoke. Words felt meaningless. Only the rhythm of Elias's whispered numbers filled the air. 1, 2, 3. Outside, the storm grew darker, carrying snow that felt almost alive as it scraped against the walls and windows. Every shadow seemed to twitch in the firelight. Thomas's eyes darted across the cabin. Every corner, every seam in the logs seemed to hide something watching, something waiting. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Hunger gnawed at Thomas with relentless persistence, sharper than the wind outside. His mind conjured shapes in the frost, faces, hands, figures moving through the snow just beyond the glass. Then the first knock of the night came, soft, deliberate, 3 times. Thomas froze. His stomach churned. Sweat mixed with frost on his skin, and fear locked his limbs. He knew it had come from inside the cabin this time. The hollow under the floorboards, the space that had vanished before. It was calling again. Elias stood slowly, dagger in hand, voice calm but firm. "It's counting," he said, "and it expects the same from us." Thomas wanted to run, to throw open the door and escape into the blizzard outside, but the snow had piled impossibly high. The ridge was a frozen wall, the forest a maze of ice. Escape was impossible. The knocks grew louder, rhythmic, moving around the cabin. They sounded from beneath the floor, behind the walls, even from the ceiling. Thomas's ears ached. Icks. His tap, tap, tap seemed to match the numbers Elias whispered. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Then a whisper curled through the cabin, soft as frost settling on a window pane. "Finish it, or it finishes you." Thomas shivered, realizing that the winter, the mountain, and whatever dwelled within the cabin's hidden spaces were one and the same. It did not just observe. It judged. It demanded. Elias gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You know what must be done. We can survive this night, but only if the counting is complete." The shadow began to move again, barely visible in the dim firelight, a presence curling along the edges of the cabin, near the floor. Thomas could see nothing concrete, yet he felt the pressure, the focus, the intelligence behind it. Hunger and fear pushed him to the edge of madness. He realized the cold outside, the storm and the empty mountains were nothing compared to the weight of waiting. And then the first violent proof. The floorboards shifted beneath them, slow and deliberate, as if something beneath had weight, something alive. Thomas's heart nearly stopped. Elias whispered, "It begins now." Next, the mountain will claim its first secret, and survival will demand an unthinkable choice between humanity and instinct. Chapter 13. Secrets beneath the floor. The cabin groaned under the relentless storm, each creak of timber echoing like a warning. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the frost-lined walls. Thomas huddled close, feeling every inch of the cold seep into his bones. Elias knelt near the floorboards, eyes fixed on a section that had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if breathing. The hollow beneath the cabin had returned, not just in sound, but in presence. Thomas swallowed hard. "It's back." Elias's hands worked swiftly, prying at the warped boards. His face was pale but resolute. "It's been waiting," he whispered, "waiting for the night to be long enough." The wind shrieked outside, but inside the cabin another sound emerged, soft tapping from beneath the floor. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. The rhythm, unmistakable. Thomas's stomach clenched. He realized something horrifying. Whatever was under the cabin wasn't just counting, it was measuring. Measuring fear, hunger, patience. Elias lifted the last board. Dust rose like a mist, mingling with frost. Below, the hollow opened wider than before, stretching into darkness. A faint metallic smell drifted up, mixed with earth and decay. Thomas leaned closer, peering into the void. Shadows seemed to shift inside, forming vague shapes. Bones, wood, dirt, and footprints, bare, fresh, leading out toward the cabin once more. Thomas stumbled back. "It's alive," he whispered. Elias did not respond. Instead, he lowered himself carefully into the hollow, dagger ready. Thomas hesitated, but fear pressed him forward. Hunger, too, had begun to blur the lines between instinct and reason. Inside, the temperature dropped further. Frost formed on their clothes as they crept along the narrow cavity. Each step echoed unnaturally, amplified by the enclosed space. Then they saw it, movement in the far corner. Somte, a thing pale, humanoid, yet impossible. Its head tilted unnaturally, its fingers scraped along the earth, leaving marks. And then it spoke. "Finish it." The voice was soft, almost pleading. Yet Thomas felt every syllable vibrate in his chest like a hammer. Elias raised the dagger. "Do you see now? It demands obedience." The hollow seemed to constrict, darkness pressing closer. Thomas realized that the shadow, the mountain, and the counting were one. And survival demanded action, a choice darker than either of them had imagined. A sudden gust of wind forced itself through the broken boards above. Dust and frost whipped around them. The voice repeated, "Let me in. Finish the count." Thomas's hands shook as he reached for the edge of the hollow. Hunger, fear, and instinct guided him now. The shadow lurked, waiting, patient and merciless. Elias whispered, "Once we start, there's no turning back." Next, Thomas and Elias confront the presence fully, and the first irreversible act of survival will unfold. Chapter 14. The First Irreversible Act. The hollow beneath the cabin seemed alive. Every breath Thomas drew felt heavier, as if the air itself were pressing against his chest. Frost clung to their clothing, icicles forming on hair and eyelashes. The shadow, or whatever it was, had shifted closer. Barely visible, yet its presence was undeniable. It moved with purpose, circling, watching and counting, though Thomas could not see a single feature. Elias knelt at the edge of the hollow, dagger poised. "It tests patience," he murmured. "It knows fear, and it will not stop until it has what it demands." Thomas swallowed, his stomach churning. Hunger and terror combined into a force he could barely resist. The shadow tapped again. 3. Pause. 3. Its rhythm echoing Elias's whispered count. "Do it," Elias said. "You know what must be done." Thomas's fingers trembled. He glanced at the shadow, then at the hollow, then at Elias. His mind screamed to retreat, to run into the blizzard outside, but he knew the snowbanks would bury them in seconds. There was no escape. The hollow seemed to widen before him, black and infinite. A metallic scent rose again, something sharp and wet, like iron drawn from deep soil. The shadow whispered, "Finish, or it finishes you." Thomas felt the weight of choice pressing on him. To obey was unthinkable. To refuse meant certain death. And in that unbearable pause, he realized that the storm outside was not the enemy. It was the mountain's way of teaching patience, cruelty, and inevitability. His hands moved almost of their own accord. Hesitantly, he reached into the hollow. The shadow recoiled slightly, almost as if acknowledging the motion. The frost scraped against his skin like tiny knives. Elias's voice was calm. "Do not hesitate. The longer you wait, the stronger it becomes." Thomas plunged deeper into the hollow. The shadow hovered near his shoulder, pressing against him like an unseen weight. It whispered, soft and insistent, 1, 2, 3. Thomas followed the rhythm, matching it with his own trembling breaths. Each movement echoed in the hollow. Each tap of his hand against the earth seemed to satisfy the unseen presence. The shadow paused. Silence stretched across the cabin. Thomas's heart pounded violently, fear coiling tightly around his ribcage. Then, relief. A shift. The pressure lifted slightly. The shadow retreated into the darkness, leaving the hollow empty once more. Elias exhaled slowly. "It accepted the count," he said. His eyes, however, were distant, haunted. For now. Thomas collapsed onto the frozen earth inside the hollow. Hunger, fear, and adrenaline left him trembling. He realized survival had come at a cost, something deeper than frostbite or starvation, something that would stay with him forever. Outside, the wind screamed. The storm showed no mercy. Inside, the cabin remained quiet, but the mountain was not done. And Thomas understood the truth. Surviving the harshest winter was only the beginning. Next, the toll of isolation and the mountain's counting will begin to unravel their minds completely. Chapter 15. The Mind Unravels. The storm showed no mercy that night. Snow pressed against the cabin in thick, frozen waves. Wind screamed through cracks and chimneys, howling like a chorus of the damned. Inside, the fire sputtered low, struggling against the cold that seemed determined to crawl into every corner. Thomas sat huddled near the hearth, trembling. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was nothing compared to the terror that had settled like a stone in his chest. Elias moved silently along the floor, whispering numbers under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Always counting, always precise. Thomas watched him, noticing how the counting had grown obsessive. Each number, each pause, each repetition seemed to tether Elias to something beyond the cabin, something that existed only in the hollow beneath the floor. "You've changed," Thomas whispered, voice shaking. "This, all of this, it's changing you." Elias did not respond. His eyes were distant, almost glassy, reflecting the flickering firelight. The counting continued. 3, pause, 3, 3, pause, 3. The rhythm was unbroken, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. Thomas tried to sleep, but the shadows seemed alive. They shifted and stretched across the frost-lined logs. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified. Every gust of wind was an approaching predator. He could feel the hollow beneath them, the shadow that lurked within, always counting, always waiting. By midnight, Thomas felt the hunger twist into something darker, a gnawing in his chest that was no longer merely physical. It was instinct, survival. And he realized with dread that the mountain, the storm, and the shadow beneath the cabin had begun to intertwine with their minds. He could hear the whispers more clearly now, faint, almost human, but layered, overlapping. "Finish. Let me in. Count. Finish." Thomas shivered violently. He saw Elias reach into the floorboards again, checking the hollow as if it might rise, as if the counting required constant affirmation. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. Frost on the logs became faces. Shadows became limbs. And then Thomas understood. The mountain demanded more than food or shelter. It demanded obedience, attention, awareness. The count was not just numbers. It was control. Suddenly, a soft tap came from the hollow. 1, 2, 3. Thomas froze. He realized he could not move. His mind, stretched thin by hunger, cold, and fear, teetered on the edge of collapse. The counting had invaded him. He could feel it inside his chest, in his thoughts, echoing in his skull. Elias turned slowly. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered. "It doesn't let you go. Not here. Not ever. Until the count is done." Thomas nodded mutely. There was no denying it. The mountain, the shadow, the storm. It had begun to own them. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, their minds unraveled. Each number in the endless sequence, another link in the chain, binding them to the mountain's will. Next, the relentless winter will push them to the brink of madness, forcing a decision no man should ever have to make. Chapter 16. Madness descends. The storm had lasted for days with no sign of reprieve. Outside, the world had vanished beneath a sea of snow, leaving the cabin suspended in white silence. Inside, the temperature had dropped so low that even the fire's warmth felt like a lie. Thomas's mind teetered on the edge. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, but it was fear, and something older, that pushed him further toward the brink. Each tap, each scrape, each whisper from beneath the cabin echoed endlessly in his skull. The counting had become a drumbeat he could not escape. Elias sat across from him, eyes wide but fixed, lips moving silently, counting without pause. Thomas realized that the numbers were no longer just spoken. They had begun to appear in his mind, haunting him even when Elias was still. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. The hollow beneath the floorboards shifted again, as if responding to their shared terror. A faint metallic smell rose into the cabin, mingling with the icy cold. Thomas gagged. He had eaten nothing substantial in days, yet his stomach turned as though the air itself carried rot and decay. Then he heard it clearly, the whisper, coaxing, teasing, almost human. Finish, or it finishes you. Thomas's hands shook as he reached for a plank, compelled to look into the hollow, to obey the rhythm of the counting that had taken root in his mind. Each second stretched into eternity. He could feel the mountain pressing down through the walls, the roof, the very floor beneath him. Elias leaned closer, voice low and harsh. It doesn't forgive hesitation. If you stop, it stops you. Thomas realized then that survival was no longer about hunger or cold. It was about submission. The shadow, the mountain, the winter itself, it demanded obedience. He could no longer tell where Elias ended and the shadow began, where the counting started and his own thou, Geats, ended. The taps came again. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. They matched his heartbeat. Thomas's chest heaved. His fingers trembled. He wanted to scream, to throw the dagger, to run, but he could not. Madness held him like iron chains. Elias whispered one final command, "Do it, or it takes everything." And then the shadow emerged from beneath the floor, fully this time, or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for the moment of surrender. Its form was indistinct, a blur of frost and shadow, yet its presence pressed against Thomas's mind like ice. Thomas reached forward, trembling, obeying the rhythm. The counting consumed him. The hollow seemed to pulse, alive with cold and unseen breath. And the storm outside raged on, indifferent, endless, unforgiving. Next, the final night of the harshest winter will test the limits of mind, body, and soul, leaving survival and sanity precariously balanced on a knife's edge. Chapter 17. The Final Night. The storm had reached its apex. Snow battered the cabin walls relentlessly, rattling the roof and pressing icy fingers through every crack. The wind screamed like a chorus of ghosts, carrying with it a sound that Thomas and Elias had grown to recognize. The counting. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Inside, the cabin was deathly quiet, except for their shallow breaths and the crackle of the failing fire. Hunger had gnawed away at Thomas for weeks, but fear now had replaced the physical ache. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak a whisper from the hollow beneath the floor. Elias knelt near the trapdoor, dagger ready, eyes fixed on the darkness below. "Tonight," he whispered, "we finish it. Or it finishes us." Thomas swallowed hard, lips dry. He felt the chill not just on his skin, but deep inside his chest, where dread had become a weight pressing on his heart. Every instinct screamed to flee, to throw open the door and vanish into the blizzard. But the snow outside was impassable. Escape was impossible. The hollow beneath them shifted again. Cold air rose, carrying the metallic scent of earth and old blood. Then came the first whisper. "Finish, or it finishes you." Thomas's stomach knotted. He could feel the counting inside him now, no longer just external. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. Every beat of his heart, every inhalation, every tremor of fear matched the rhythm. Elias's voice cut through the terror. "Do not hesitate. This is the last test. Do it, or lose everything." Thomas's hands trembled as he lowered the plank and peered into the hollow. Darkness pressed at him. Shapes moved just beyond comprehension. Bones, frost, shadows, and the faintest glint of something pale and watching. The air smelled of iron and decay. Then it lunged. Or perhaps it was the wind. Thomas could not tell. But the shadow swept against him like living ice. He stumbled back, barely gripping the edge of the hollow. Elias grabbed his arm. "Now! Match it! Count it!" Thomas's voice broke the silence, echoing against the frost-lined logs. 1, 2, 3. The hollow seemed to pulse. The shadow recoiled slightly, then pressed forward again, testing, counting. Thomas's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. The fire flickered. Frost formed along the floorboards. Every instinct screamed to run. Every nerve burned. He repeated the rhythm. Elias joined in. Together, they matched the count. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, 3. For a moment, silence followed. The storm outside roared, but the cabin itself seemed still. The shadow lingered in the corner, patient, observing. Elias breathed slowly. It's done, for now. Thomas slumped to the floor, trembling, exhausted. Hunger, fear, and madness had nearly consumed him. He realized something terrifying. Survival had been bought with obedience, not strength. Outside, the mountain waited, patient, cold, indifferent, and Thomas knew with icy certainty that the winter was far from over. Next, only dawn can reveal what the harshest winter has truly taken from them, and whether either man will leave the mountains alive. Chapter 18. Dawn of the Frozen Reckoning. The storm had finally begun to ease. Morning light, pale and weak, filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. The world outside was unrecognizable. Drifts towered like walls, and the ridge disappeared into endless white. Silence stretched across the mountains, broken only by the groaning of ice-laden trees and the distant crack of frozen branches. Inside, Thomas and Elias were motionless. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, frostbite creeping along exposed skin, and eyes haunted by weeks of hunger and terror. The counting had stopped, or so they thought, but a quiet, unnatural weight still pressed against the cabin walls. Thomas moved first, shaking his frozen hands. He glanced toward the floorboards. The hollow beneath that had haunted them. Nothing stirred. No shadow. No whisper. Only silence. Elias rose slowly, dagger still in hand, eyes scanning every corner. "We survived the night," he said softly, though the words felt hollow. "But it watches still." Thomas nodded, voice weak. Did we finish it?" Elias's gaze was distant, almost reverent. "We obeyed. That's all it cares about. For now." The cabin felt smaller than ever, the frost curling along the walls like skeletal fingers. Thomas shivered, realizing the true cost of survival. Hunger could be endured, cold could be resisted. But the mind could not remain untouched by weeks of counting, whispers and shadows. They stepped outside cautiously. The world was silent, unbroken, yet somehow more oppressive than the storm. Footprints marked their path to the cabin, but none returned from the hollow, none beyond the door. Whatever had counted, whatever had tested them, remained unseen, patient, waiting. Thomas looked at Elias. "We survived the harshest winter in the mountains. But at what cost?" Elias's eyes were shadowed. "We left peaky art of ourselves behind, and it will follow us, even if we leave these mountains." The wind picked up again, cold and biting, carrying the faintest whisper on its currents, almost imperceptible yet chilling. 1, 2, 3. Finish. Thomas felt it in his chest. The counting had not ended. It never ends. The mountain, the hollow, and the shadow beneath the cabin had claimed more than their bodies. They had claimed their minds, leaving only a hollow obedience. The two men turned back toward the cabin. The storm had passed, but the memory of the longest, darkest nights lingered like frost that refuses to melt. They walked slowly through the snow, knowing the mountain would never truly let them go, and that the harshest winter had marked them forever. As they vanished into the ridge, the hollow beneath the cabin settled once more into silence. But deep in the snow, a faint, single footprint pressed downward, unaccompanied by any other, as if the mountain itself had paused to watch. And somewhere, faintly, almost too soft to hear, "Count, or it counts for you." The Appalachian Mountains remained indifferent, patient, unforgiving, and the story of survival, hunger, and the counting shadow became one of those unspeakable truths the snow keeps buried, forever waiting for the next winter.